Ukrainian forces liberated Donetsk villages, struck Novomykhailivka and Russian refineries, securing battlefield advantage.
On Donetsk's scorching battle line, as the sky shook with the roar of heavy artillery, the armed forces of Ukraine carried out a counteroffensive that went down in history. The villages of Mykhailivka, Zelenyi Hai, and Volodymyrivka were liberated after days of fighting. This moment was not merely a shift of a few points on a map. It was a reborn hope for the Ukrainian people, and, for the soldiers at the front, the strongest proof of resistance. Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky personally went to the Pokrovsk front to meet the soldiers. Looking at the weary but determined faces, his words were etched into the heart of the entire nation. Defending independence is not a slogan that sounds nice. It is a heroism given every day at the cost of lives. At Pokrovsk, the 25th Airborne Brigade, the 68th Jaeger, and the 32nd and 155th Mechanized Brigades had been holding off numerically superior enemy assaults for weeks, without abandoning their positions. Shortages at the front were quickly resolved. Ammunition supplied from the west reached the area. Electronic warfare systems were deployed to disrupt enemy communications, and swarms of FPV drones hunted Russian artillery positions one by one, while mobile air defense units connected to radar systems shot down Shahed-type unmanned aerial vehicles in the skies. Ukraine's technological maneuvers not only inflicted military losses on Moscow, but also dealt a psychological blow. For Kremlin's propaganda of victory was shattered by Pokrovsk's resistance. Each liberated village, with the blue and yellow flag flying, turned into a symbol of morale. This flag was not just a symbol, it was proof of the will of the people, the courage of the soldiers, and the fact that Ukraine would never surrender. In the settlements that had spent months under the shadow of occupation, the national anthem echoed once again, giving strength to every soldier fighting on the front line. For Russia, these losses might have seemed like a tactical setback, but the real collapse began behind the lines, because every new Ukrainian victory eroded the morale of Russian troops and created cracks in the Kremlin's chain of command. The strategic importance of Pokrovsk was immense. If this defensive line in western Donetsk were to break, cities like Slovyansk and Kramatorsk would be at risk. But Ukraine's counteroffensive foiled this plan. Now Moscow had to transfer its reserve forces to this area. This meant weakness on the remaining fronts. The strategic balance was shifting in Ukraine's favor, and Russia's breathing space was shrinking. But the real question begins here. Will Ukraine use this momentum only in defense, or is it preparing for a larger counteroffensive? The answer came soon enough, for in another village in Donetsk, a shocking operation was about to begin that caught Russia completely unprepared. Just days after the first success on the Donetsk front, the Ukrainian army launched a new move that caught the enemy completely off guard. The operation in Novomykhailivka went down in the history of the front as the ambushed Russian line. Directed by the Defense Intelligence Directorate and carried out by the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Assault Brigade, the operation began silently at midnight. The Russian troops, believing the area was safe, had relaxed their positions. But when Ukrainian armored vehicles suddenly advanced to the entrance of the village, every movement was being watched from above by Bayraktar TB2s. When the enemy's radio recordings were later intercepted, the scale of panic on the ground became clear. A Russian commander was shouting to headquarters, begging for support. No reserves. They've all been redeployed to another front. Within just a few hours, the Russian side lost a company-sized unit. Tanks were abandoned. Ammunition depots were struck by Ukrainian drones. Throughout the night, HIMARS strikes targeted supply lines north of the village, and by dawn, special operations teams completed the clearing. This operation was not merely about taking a village. Novomykhailivka was a critical lock in the Russian defensive line. Losing it collapsed the entire defense chain in the region. As Ukrainian soldiers raised the flag in the morning, Morale dominance took hold of the front. For Moscow, this unexpected loss was a bitter warning. The front line was no longer under control. Reserves had to be withdrawn from other regions, which meant weakness elsewhere. The victory in Novomykhailivka declared to the world that Ukraine had seized the initiative. For Russia, this was not only a military blow, but also a psychological collapse. The Kremlin's propaganda was undone by the quiet yet resolute Ukrainian resistance in the village. As soldiers savored the triumph, new plans were being drawn up in command centers. For the war was about to ignite not only on Donetsk soil, but also deep inside Russia. Now the critical question was this: will Ukraine be content with this bold move, or will it strike directly at the enemy's lifeline? The answer came a few days later, with an operation that set the skies over the Samara region ablaze. On the night of August 24th, Ukraine's shadow war operation struck like a dagger into the heart of Russia. The Syzran oil refinery in the Samara region was targeted by a coordinated assault of unmanned systems. The sky suddenly lit up. Flames rose dozens of meters high as Russia's energy facility, with an annual capacity of 8.5 million tons, was rendered inoperative overnight. This refinery was one of the most critical centers, supplying the Russian army with diesel, aviation fuel, and gasoline. Ukraine's choice of this target was clear: to cut the fuel lifeline of Moscow's war machine. Behind the operation was a meticulous plan. Ukraine's intelligence agency, HUR, conducted satellite scans of the facility for weeks, identifying radar blind spots. Then electronic warfare units paralyzed the air defense systems. In the late hours of the night, waves of unmanned aerial vehicles struck the refinery's gas condensate units. The chain of explosions was so powerful that Russia's regional energy distribution network was completely knocked out. After the attack, Moscow tried to conceal the information flow, but leaked footage clearly showed massive smoke columns and fuel depots burning to ashes. This was not just sabotage, but the sign of a systematic strategy. The General Staff declared that these operations focused on a single objective: destabilizing the enemy's logistical capacity and gradually eroding its war potential. The strike on Syzran demonstrated to the world that Ukraine had reached the capacity to wage war not only on the front lines, but also deep inside Russia. For the Kremlin, the bitter truth was this: the rear areas they considered safe were no longer safe. Russian diesel tankers halted, the flight schedules of air units were disrupted, and logistical chains collapsed. But the most shocking development had yet to occur. For that same night, Ukraine was about to deliver an even greater blow to the heart of Russia's energy trade on the shores of the Baltic Sea. The explosions at the Ust-Luga terminal would strip Moscow one by one of its trump cards on the world energy map. While the flames at the Syzran refinery had not yet been extinguished, that same night another Ukrainian operation delivered a heavy blow to Russia. In the Leningrad region, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, the Ust-Luga maritime terminal was targeted by unmanned aerial vehicles. Operating with an annual capacity of 6.9 million tons, this terminal was one of Moscow's most critical gateways in energy trade. Moreover, the shadow fleet that the Kremlin used to bypass sanctions, its secret corridor to Europe, was managed from here. The attack began at midnight, carried out in waves that exploited radar blind spots. The first target was the gas condensate fractionation unit. Hit with pinpoint accuracy by UAVs, the facility instantly caught fire, with explosions triggering a chain reaction. Smoke columns rising over the terminal could be seen from kilometers away. At the same time, logistics centers in Belgorod and Voronezh regions were also attacked. Each was a vital node feeding the Russian army's ammunition and fuel flow. These strikes were not only against military infrastructure, but also dealt heavy blows to Russia's international energy leverage. Moscow had been using oil and gas trade as a pressure tool against the West. But with these moves that undermined this strategy, Ukraine began to squeeze the Kremlin's global trade lifeline. The smoke rising over the Baltic coast was not just the burning of a facility, it was the symbol of Russia's fragility and desperation. Moscow tried to conceal the effects of the attack, but the images that surfaced on social media and the information obtained from NATO satellite scans proved that it was impossible to hide the truth. As the Kremlin's propaganda machine fell silent, the world saw that Ukraine was beginning to dominate not only on the battlefield, but also in the energy war. Yet, Ukraine's strikes were not only coming from the skies. In the occupied territories, there was another war, unseen but highly effective. Silent footsteps, covert actions, and small acts of sabotage were, in fact, targeting a vast logistical chain, and a spark that exploded between the rails near Melitopol would bring a new nightmare to the Russian army. While smoke from the explosions on the Baltic coast was still rising into the sky, Ukraine's invisible army opened a quiet but effective front in the occupied territories. In the Zaporizhzhia region, near Melitopol, a massive explosion suddenly occurred on the railway line. A relay cabinet had blown up, rendering the entire line inoperable. These rails were one of the most critical arteries for transporting ammunition, fuel, and troops for the Russian army. What seemed like a small attack actually caused the collapse of a vast logistical chain. The operation was claimed by the ATESH partisan movement, the unseen heroes of Ukraine's war. Unarmed, without uniforms, appearing as ordinary people by day, these fighters turned into the Kremlin's nightmare at night. The effect of an attack carried out with just a few kilos of explosives was so immense that Russia's supply plans in the region were disrupted for days. Trains stopped, ammunition shipments were delayed, and headquarters were shaken by emergency signals. For the Russian chain of command, the real devastation lay in what this attack signified. Not a single inch of occupied land was secure. The sabotage campaign that began earlier in Crimea, with explosives planted at bridge supports, had now spread across a wide stretch from Melitopol to Donbass. Despite Moscow's heavy security measures, small cells were capable of inflicting massive blows. A relay cabinet exploding on a railway line was, in fact, a declaration to the world that the Kremlin's narrative of control was collapsing from within. The power of the partisans lay not only in logistical strikes, but also in psychological warfare. They showed the Ukrainian people that resistance continued even in occupied cities, while making Russian soldiers feel that every step they took was being watched. These invisible warriors were as impactful as cannons and tanks. Because an army cut off from its logistics, no matter how modern its weapons, rapidly loses its ability to fight. But the war was not being fought only underground. It raged fiercely in the skies as well. Moscow was preparing one of the largest drone assaults in history against Ukraine. On that night, when the engines of hundreds of unmanned aircraft roared to life, the sky would turn into hell itself. On the night of August 24th, Russia launched one of the largest drone strikes it had ever carried out against Ukraine. From bases in Kursk, Oryol, Milerovo, and Primorsko-Akhtarsk, a total of 104 Shahed-type kamikaze UAVs took off, swarming into Ukrainian airspace from multiple directions. As the sound of their engines filled the night, the sky suddenly became a roaring inferno. But this time, Ukraine was ready. As soon as radar systems picked up the first signals, mobile air defense units sprang into action. Patriot batteries had been positioned around Kyiv, while NASAM systems guarded central regions. Bayraktar TB-2 drones glided low to mark targets, and MiG-29 fighter jets climbed into the night sky using night vision systems. Electronic warfare units jammed the control signals of enemy drones, forcing them off course. Within minutes, the hunt that began in the sky shattered Russia's calculations. According to official statements released in the following hours, 76 drones were neutralized. Some were shot down, others forced to crash after losing their signals. Attacks were confirmed in 28 different locations, but while wreckage fell in some areas, Ukrainian forces swiftly restored control. The massive destruction planned by the Kremlin was thwarted. the cities awoke to a bright morning. Yet the message from this assault was clear. Russia still possessed enormous production capacity and was trying to exhaust Ukraine's defensive lines with cheap, massed attacks. This was a new strategy, forcing expensive air defense systems to chase down low-cost drones. Ukraine's technological ingenuity and its US-backed air defense architecture had saved the night, but the question remained: how could such intense assaults be countered in the long run? At this point, it became evident that Kyiv could not endure alone. More sophisticated systems from the West, a constant supply of munitions, and new generation radar technologies were no longer an option. They had become a necessity, because the war raging in the skies was not merely a battle of one night. It was a laboratory where the doctrine of future warfare was being shaped. And when dawn broke, the entire world understood one thing: Ukraine was no longer just defending, it was moving toward taking the initiative. But what did this picture mean for Ukraine? The answer lay in the convergence of all the recent operations, a new Ukraine, walking the path to victory with a multi-dimensional strategy. The developments of recent weeks have shown that Ukraine is no longer confined to defense. Rather, it has become the force that dictates the rhythm of the war. In the Donetsk front, the villages of Mykhailivka, Zelenyi Hai, and Volodymyrivka were liberated. At Novomykhailivka, the Russian front was caught off guard. These moves were not only tactical gains, but also symbolic victories that boosted the morale of Ukrainian soldiers. But the most devastating blows were struck deep behind enemy lines. In the Samara region, the Syzran refinery, one of the beating hearts fueling Russia's war machine, was struck. When the Ust-Luga terminal on the Baltic coast was targeted, Moscow's leverage in international energy trade began to weaken. These strikes shattered Russia's perception of secure rear areas. The Kremlin was no longer at ease, even within its own homeland. Meanwhile, partisan movements in the occupied territories continued to sever Russia's logistical arteries. The destruction of the railway near Melitopol was not merely the elimination of a relay cabinet. It was the halting of a colossal ammunition supply line. This invisible war was the clearest evidence of the collapse of the Kremlin's illusion of control. And in the skies, on the night when 104 drones were unleashed simultaneously upon Ukraine, Russia's strategy of mass assault revealed its attempt to escalate the war to an industrial scale. But Ukraine, with US-supplied Patriot and NASAM systems, and with its own electronic warfare assets, repelled the strike. The downing of 76 drones was not just a military success, it was a declaration that Ukraine can defend its skies. This picture clearly demonstrates Ukraine's multi-dimensional war doctrine: villages retaken at the front, energy facilities struck at the heart of Russia, partisan sabotage in occupied territories, and dominance established in the skies. Russia was now forced to fight, not on one front, but across 4 dimensions simultaneously. The message to the world was clear: Ukraine resists not only for its own freedom, but also for Europe's security. And with the United States leading, every bit of support from the West becomes a building block in this struggle. Even as the Kremlin's threats grow louder, the reality is that Ukraine's strategic moves are exposing Russia's weaknesses one by one. The real question today is this: how close has this multi-front strategy brought Ukraine to ultimate victory? The answer lies within the war itself, because each new day writes another headline that alters the course of history. And that headline can be summed up in a single message: peace, justice, and freedom are now raining down from the sky. What you are seeing are not merely fleeting images of a war. They are the rebirth of a people's honor, freedom, and will. The flags waving in the villages of Donetsk, the soldiers standing steadfast on the Pokrovsk line, and the unmanned aircraft hunting in the skies, all cry out the same truth: Ukraine will not give up, and it never will. But this struggle is not fought only at the front. It continues here, on your screen as well. because the voice of truth echoes louder when you keep it alive. If you feel this story has touched your heart, take a moment to support this video. Liking helps this message reach more people. Subscribing means standing with us in every new chapter of this struggle. And most importantly, commenting allows your thoughts, feelings, and ideas to reach millions. Perhaps a single sentence you write will inspire another viewer to believe in this fight. Remember, history is written not only on battlefields, but also in hearts. The war Ukraine is fighting is not only for its own freedom, but for Europe's security and the dignity of humanity. And as long as you stand with us here, watching, you are already part of this history. So now I ask you, what do you think Ukraine's next great move should be? In your eyes, where is the most critical point of this resistance? Share your thoughts with us. Join the discussion, because your voice makes this story stronger. Our final word is this: peace, justice, and freedom are not gifts that fall from the sky. They are the reward of the struggle we fight together. We will continue to tell this story. Be with us, subscribe, like, comment. Because this is not just a video, it is the story of our shared future,